Okay, guys. We are going to talk about a very not well-known lady in the Old Testament, which, let's be honest, is a fair amount of the characters. And her name is Michal. I'm going to share my screen. Share. How's everybody doing? I can't hear you because it's a recording, so. Okay, Michal. Yes, that's Hebrew. Me call. Isn't that fun? So who is Michal? So in this class, we're going to kind of deep dive into Michal's biblical identity and like kind of the way that the authors write the character of Michal and how Michal is placed in the story of King David and basically forgotten about throughout the rest of the Bible. And then we're going to go through what's called an exegetical study of the language used in David and Michal's famous argument, where David is dancing in the streets and Michal is standing at the window, judging him as he dances through the streets, kind of naked. So I would be judging him too. This is actually from my seminary days when I was in Dr. Park's second Samuel class, which was a fantastic class. And she really encouraged all of her students to think very critically and to kind of put your theology, just let it sit aside and study the actual text. And so that is what I'm going to try to do. And that's really the way that I approach all my biblical study is I try to do so through a scholarly lens, which means possibly placing my beliefs, not putting them out the door, but letting them have a seat at the table silently. Because for me as a minister, it's important for me to be authentic in my faith and to wrestle with the human error and the translations and the mythological perceptions that are happening, especially in the Old Testament. So we're going to do that today with Michal. So there are some key figures in Michal's story. The first is King David, her first and last husband, and as I like to say, an ultimate F-boy. King David, as much as we love him, as much as we need David for the Davidic lineage of Jesus Christ, who fulfills the prophecy that one day David's lineage will return to lead the Jews. King David wasn't that solid of a dude. Um, he treated Michal, his wife, like garbage. We're going to talk about Paltiel. That is the second husband who cried when Michal was taken away from him. He loved Michal. He loved Michal. And King David took Michal away from him after treating Michal terribly and discarding her. I'm going to talk about Michal, the second daughter of King Saul, a princess, an estranged wife of David, and ultimately David's savior. We would not have King David if not for Michal. And then we're going to talk about King Saul. Was he paranoid? Maybe, but maybe he had a reason to be a bit mistrusting of David. He was the king of um, he was a king and a father of Michal, and he was killed. Uh, we're not really quite sure if he fell on his sword or an Amalekite, never can say it right, killed him. Um, we'll get to it. So let's look first at the biblical portrayal of Michal in Second Samuel. So we have a couple references of Michal in First Samuel, Second Samuel, and First Chronicles. The name of Michal is allied to Micaiah, or also to Michael, which means who is like Jehovah. Michal, along with the cognates, Micaiah or Michael, illustrates a comparatively small class of proper names composed of more than two words. It is a name describing an admiring acknowledgement of the transcendent and unapproachable majesty of divine nature. We know that Michal was the youngest daughter of Saul, Israel's first king. Her mother was Ahinoam. She became David's first wife, was given to Phalti, the son of Laish, of Galim for a while, but was recovered by David. As the aunt of of her sister Merab's five sons, Michal ultimately cared for them after the premature death of her sister. Excuse me. So let's look at the identity and the way that the author portrays Michal in the story of David. She's portrayed a couple different ways as a princess, as someone who is of an elite status of Israel. We see her, and we will dive into these texts, as possibly dishonored, someone who is loyal, but only to her detriment, um, someone who is desirous and wants to be loved, but isn't. We see her as a woman in love. She really, really was in love with King David, we think. I'm not sure about that second husband, but we'll get to that in a second. So let's look at the first mention, the first key story of Michal. Let's read it together. This is from 1 Samuel 18, verses 12 through 30. I need to move my little thing. Saul was afraid of David because the Lord was with David, but had departed from Saul. So he sent David away from him and gave him command over 1,000 men. David led the troops in their campaigns. In everything he did, he had great success because the Lord was with him. So there's the authorship trying to kind of propagandically line you up to be seeing David as someone who the Lord walks with. When Saul saw how successful he was afraid of him. All of Israel and Judah loved David because he led them in their campaigns. So Saul, recognizing this threat to his power, said to David, "Here's my older daughter, Merab. I will give her to you in marriage, but only serve me bravely and fight the battles of the Lord." Saul said to himself, "I will not raise a hand against him. Let the Philistines do that." But David said to Saul, "Who am I, and what is my family or my clan in Israel that I should become the king's son-in-law?" So when the time came for Merab, Saul's oldest daughter, or yeah, older daughter, to be given to David, she instead was given in marriage to Adriel of Mahola. However, there is this girl, Saul's other daughter, Michal, was in love with David. And when they told Saul about it, he was pleased. "I will give her to him, so that she may be a snare to him, and so that the hand of the Philistines may be against him." So Saul said to David, "Now you have a second opportunity to become my son-in-law." Then Saul ordered his attendants, "Speak to David privately and say, 'Look, the king likes you, and his attendants all love you. Now become his son-in-law.'" So they repeated these words to David, but David said, "Do you think it is a small matter to become the king's son-in-law? I'm only a poor man and little known." Oh my gosh, sneeze. Okay, didn't sneeze. When Saul's servants told him what the David had said, Saul replied, "Say to David, the king wants no other price for the bride than 100 Philistine foreskins to take revenge on his enemies." Saul's plan was to have David fall by the hands of the Philistines. This is also a thing called foreshadowing, where we see an element of a story foreshadow an event that happens later. So, what might this be foreshadowing? If you're thinking, "Oh, perhaps this behavior is seen in King David with Bathsheba's husband Uriah, who King David sends to be at the front of the battle lines," you are correct. Gold star for you. All right, back to it. When the attendants told David these things, he was pleased to become the king's son-in-law. So before the allotted time, David took men without him. He killed 200 Philistines and brought back brought back their foreskins. They counted out the full number to the king so that David might become his son-in-law. Then Saul gave him Michal in marriage. So at this point in time, we're imagining Saul being like, "Oh, he actually got 200 men's foreskins. I guess I do have to marry him into the family. He's still alive. Darn it." When Saul realized that the Lord was with David and that his daughter Michal loved David, Saul became even more afraid of him, and he remained his enemies the rest of his days. The Philistine commanders continue to go out in battle as they often did, and David keeps becoming more and more successful, and his name keeps being more and more well known. Interesting stuff, my friends. How do I get out of this? La la la. All right. Michal was a wife who found herself in a very awkward but very common family feud, where there is the family that you are a part of and born into, and then there's the family that you married into. And the family that Michal married into, well, we don't really know much about King David's family, really, but we know that King David was in an awkward relationship with Saul. And while Michal loved David with all of her heart, she still was King Saul's biological daughter. It's quite gruesome to imagine a dowry being, well, it wouldn't be a dowry, a men's dowry, a bride price or whatever, being 100 foreskins or 200 foreskins. But that's greatly significant in Israelite history and symbology. It would prove that David is a warrior and that he is able to do this great feat of violence, but it also is covenantal. The circumcision that David is asked to do of these 200 or 100 foreskins of the penis, sorry, I'm sure, uh, is a physical symbol of the covenant with God that the Israelites have. And in the fact that David is killing the Philistines and not some other tribal group is this forced conversion of dead, cadaveric uh, conversion of the Philistines to the power of the Israelites. And it is a public demonstration of Israel's military strength to the neighboring tribes. Saul was pretty sure, and I think anybody would be, that David would be killed. And so when David is actually triumphant in this feat, it really actually brings David up and calls his name to attention in the region. And instead of giving just 100 foreskins, he kind of he overdoes it. He does double. He brings 200, claims his bride, Michal, the son, and becomes the rightful public figure in the family of King Saul. However, Michal, as much as she loved David, I believe that David saw Michal really just as a pawn in his game for power. Michal was presented as this woman who's deeply in love with King David, well, at this time, David, and she is someone who seems like she comes across as very loyal. She also serves as a representation of Saul's blessing, of Saul giving authority to David to eventually take his place in his stead down the road, which we know is not actually so peaceful, transferring. In 1 Samuel 18:20, it says that Michal loves David, and it's the only place in the Bible where a woman's love for a man, like a romantic love, is recorded. And this is in the Old Testament, the Jewish Bible. However, there's no biblical record of David ever saying he loved Michal. And as we will continue to study, it seems that's the case. He does not seem to love her. So here's our second verse to study tonight with the story of Michal. This is from 1 Samuel chapters 19, verses 1 through 17. Listen for the word of God. Saul told his son Jonathan, who we think has had an interesting relationship with David, by the way, and all the attendants to kill David. But Jonathan had taken a great liking to David, what did I tell you? And warned him, my father Saul is looking for a chance to kill you. Be on your guard tomorrow morning, go into hiding, and stay there. I will go out and stand with my father in the field where you are. I'll speak to him about you, and I will tell you what I find. Jonathan spoke well of David to Saul his father and said to him, let not the king do wrong to his servant David. He has not wronged you, and what he has done has benefited you greatly. He took his life in his hands when he killed the Philistines. The Lord won a great victory over all of Israel, and you saw it and you were glad. Why then would you want to do wrong to an innocent man like David by killing him for no reason? Saul listened to Jonathan and took the oath. Surely as the Lord lives, David will not be put to death. So David calls Jonathan. Jonathan calls David and tells him the whole conversation. He brought him to Saul, and Saul and David were all good. Everything's fine. But then once more, war breaks out. David goes out and he fights the Philistines. He struck them with such force they fled before him. But an evil spirit from the Lord came on Saul as he was sitting in his house with a spear in his hand. While David was playing the lyre, Saul tried to pin him to the wall with his spear. And David eluded him as Saul drove the spear into the wall. That night, David made good his escape. So Saul sent men to David's house to watch it and kill him in the morning. But Michal, David's wife, warned him, if you don't run for your life tonight, tomorrow you'll be killed. So Michal let David down through the window and he fled and escaped. Then Michal took an idol and laid it on her bed, covering it with a garment and putting some goat's hair at the head. When Saul sent the men to capture David, Michal said he is ill. And then Saul sent the men back to see David and told them, bring him up to me in his bed so that I may kill him. But when the men entered, there was the idol in the bed, and at the head was some goat's hair. Saul said to Michal, why did you deceive me like this and send my enemy away so that he escaped? Michal told him, he said to me, let me get away. Why should I kill you? What? Crazy. So that last line, McCall told him, he said to me, let me get away. Why should I kill you? McCall's kind of like, he was gonna hurt me, have to do it. But we all know McCall. McCall, she was a ride or die for David. She was just afraid of her dad. Michal risked her father's wrath by helping David escape out the window in 1 Samuel 19. Then she fools the men who come to kill David by putting an idol or a statue of teraphim under a blanket, topping it with a net of goat's hair. We also see the teraphim in a different place in the Old Testament. I can't remember what story. It's pretty. It might be. It might be. I can't remember, but there is a story in the Old Testament, another story where women use teraphim, the family idols, to deceive men. So this is once again a callback, an activity, like something that's happened before in the Bible that we're seeing reenacted. She told the envoy David was sick, couldn't go to her father, and then her father said blah blah blah, and she lies and says, "You gave him to me as a husband." McCall told her father, he's a soldier and a violent man, and he held a sword on me and made me help him. So she kind of puts David's escape back on her father and on David. She's just the wife. She's trying to survive. And by helping David escape, she actually helps him live out the fulfillment of becoming a king. Saul tried to block David's claim to the throne after this by giving the call to another man, Paltiel. After Saul died, David returns. So after Saul dies, I can't remember if it's the end of First Samuel or at the beginning of Second Samuel. David comes back to claim Michal as his wife. And why would he do that? Because that is his right. But also because if you're coming into power, it's important to have that family relationship intact. So not because he loved her, but because her lineage strengthened David's claim to the throne. Paltiel, the husband who Michal had been given to after David just totally ditches Michal, is broken. And that's just a really sad little teeny line in the story. One of David's many, I don't know, victims. And there's nothing ever mentioned of McCall's emotions at this. We don't know how McCall feels. And in the Old Testament, it is very common to see women treated as property. They had very low status in society in this region at this time. And so they really were instruments of men's power. Here is a third story. And this is a story that might be the most familiar to most of us. This is 2 Samuel 6, verses 16 through 23. As the ark of the Lord came into the city of David, Michal, the daughter of Saul, looked out the window and saw King David leaping and dancing before the Lord. She despised him in her heart. And they brought in the ark of the Lord and set it in its place, inside the tent that David had pitched for it. David offered burnt offerings and a peace offering before the Lord. When David had finished offering the burnt offerings and the peace offerings, he blessed the people in the name of the Lord of hosts and distributed among the people, the multitude of Israel, both men and women, cake, portion of meat, and raisins. Then all the people departed, each to his house. David returned to bless his household, but Michal, the daughter of Saul, came out to meet David and said, how the king of Israel honored himself today, uncovering himself before the eyes of his servants, female servants. as one of the vulgar fellows shamelessly uncovers himself. And David said to Michal, it was before the Lord who chose me above your father and above all his house, to appoint me as a prince over Israel, the people of the Lord. And I will celebrate before the Lord. I will make myself yet even more contemptible than this, and I will be abased in your eyes. But by the female servants of whom you have spoken, by them I shall be held in honor. And Michal, the daughter of Saul, had no child to the day of her death. What is happening? So in the Bible, if a woman doesn't have children, it is either she has piss. The idea of a barren woman is God's dishonor upon you. So this last sentence, verse 23, Michal, the daughter of Saul, had no child, is the biblical authorship basically flipping their thumb up at Michal for trying to put David in his place and trying to admonish David and his behavior. Michal is the one who, in the authorship's eyes, is the one who is deserving of her barrenness. It's also very interesting because, and we have to think critically, why would this matter? Why do we care if Michal and David had children? Because that would affect the Davidic lineage. That would affect the Davidic legacy that leads us to Joseph and Mary and Joseph's child, Jesus. Jesus is seen in the New Testament as the Messiah prophesied in the Old Testament to come. He is the fulfillment of this Davidic legacy in this lineage that is prophesied about for thousands or hundreds of years, hundreds of years. It's a lot to chew in. Um, Also, Nicole is of the social status. She is of a wealthy and affluent people. She grew up in power. She knows how kings should behave. David did not. And so when David behaves in a way that is perhaps seen as lower class, and McCall admonishes him and reminds him, as she is doing, as any good wife would do, to behave and to act accordingly, she's basically kind of selling him like, you're acting low class, my friend. Like, husband, this is not how we do. This is not how kings behave. She is trying to help her husband with his newfound social status, and he is not having it. So let's look at this in an exegetical study. In the biblical narrative, what we see here and what we saw today is that Michal chooses the welfare of David over the welfare of Saul, her father. And when she let David down through the window and hides the teraphim in her bed as a ruse, David flees and he just abandons Michal. He's like, screw that. And then Michal is given as a prize to this Palti son of Laish, which I don't know much about. And we find out through the text that actually, as this is going on, David is taking other wives. So it's not like David is pining for his wife in exile, um, including a woman named Abigail. And so when David returns to become king of Judah um, and king of Israel, David demands that she be returned to him so that there is peace. Michal's brother, Ishbosheth, who is the one who kind of facilitates this, despite the public protest of Paltiel. It's just a really gruesome and ugly experience, and it is once again, like I said, the enforcement of women subsiding or giving their power to men because they have no power at this time. And so when she talks to David about being undignified as he brings the Ark of the Covenant into the Jerusalem for this big religious procession, she is punished, according to Samuel, with never having children. So let's look at this one moment where the ark is being transferred into Jerusalem. And why does this matter? And why does the behavior of King David matter so much here? King David is told that Yahweh has blessed the house of Obed-Edom. And all he had to do is just because he brought this holy ark back into the city. And so he goes and he brings Yahweh's ark up from the house of Obed-Edom to the city of David with festivity. And it's this glorious moment of Jewish power and Israel being reinstated as God's holy people in God's holy place. And they're going to build a temple for this amazing ark that is coming, and they're going to have connection with God. Everything's great because that is how this covenant is going to be fulfilled. So we see David, who is in this linen, it's called an ephod, strumming this instrument before Yahweh. And as the ark is processing into the city, and Michal is watching through a window and she sees this behavior, she is just like aghast. And there's something to note here. Before we get to this particular moment in the story, there is a little bit of a side note where there's some fear around the ark being brought into Jerusalem because there was a priest who accidentally touched the ark and he was struck dead by lightning. So there, I kind of wonder, and so the ark is almost temporarily held in this spot uh, at the house of Obed-Edom, um, while people are kind of figuring out, oh my gosh, can we bring it in? Is it safe? Are we, that guy died. There's a lot of fear around the ark. So I wonder almost there's like this PR push from David and his people to create this spirit of joy and festivity after this death had just happened, and to help the people not be so afraid of this procession of the ark and to see the power and glory of God come into Jerusalem, God's city, for God's people. So let's just keep that in mind that that happened, and that is kind of the ethos of the moment. Yahweh's ark was in enemy hands until the Philistines, who David cut their foreskins off of, returned it to Israelite territory with an offering of gold. So David organizes this expedition to Kiriath Jearim to bring the ark to Jerusalem. And like I said, there's an incident where a priest who is helping carry the ark is struck down by Yahweh, what we think possibly could be lightning, but we don't know. David is annoyed and frightened. He suspends plans. Like I said, it stays in that weird house. And then the procession resumes, and when we see David acting all crazy and dancing, possibly naked or half naked through the streets. Very, very interesting story. In Yahweh's presence, I am a dancer, said David to Michal. Blessed by Yahweh, who chose me over your father in all his house to appoint prince over his people, Israel. I'll revel before Yahweh, behaving even more shamelessly than this, and humiliate myself before his eyes. As for the wenches you mentioned, let them think me distinguished. I like this interpretation because it's more digestible to me. Um, but it is really interesting. In Yahweh's presence, I am a dancer. I do love that line. I do. Um, this is, like I said, a great spot for the writers to raise Jesus, David up as this pious man. Blessed be Yahweh, who chose me over your dad, who is dead, and appointed me to rule. So David is placing his wife under his thumb, kind of saying, look, lady, this is my right. I'll revel before Yahweh, but behaving even more shamelessly than this. So we see that we know that David is scantily clad, exposing himself with his dancing, and we just really don't know much about it. And so Michal, daughter of Saul, was childless. David or God, something, she's cursed with barrenness. And also could be, like we said, like, I mean, maybe she and David just didn't have a sexual relationship, and maybe they never really had relations, and that's why she was cursed. Cursed by God, cursed by David. We really don't know. We do know that David was married to at least one or two other women at this time, including Abigail. And David had other wives. And Second Samuel 6 closes with the story of Michal. It says that out of many wives of David in the Bible, to her dying day, Michal, daughter of Saul, had no children. An entry in the Jewish Women Bible says that the rabbis interpret this to mean that Michal died in childbirth, bearing David's son Ithream, but there's no scriptural references to that. Did David refuse to have sex with his first wife in order to deny her children, considering that would have been the greatest blessing of the Israelite family line, or the continuation of Saul's legacy through David? Did David imprison Michal? Because she's consistently referred to as daughter of Saul versus wife of David, which that's kind of weird, right? Scripture does not say after the Second Samuel 6 anything else. She disappears from the list of the many wives of King David in the Bible. Michal's punishment, we really, like I said, we don't really know. We do have Michal's nephews brought up at some point in Second Samuel 20 verses 21, 8, that her older sister Merab dies and leaves five sons, and Michal raises them as if they were her own offspring. Um, McCall Saul's, this is an interesting, from a scholarly perspective, this is an interesting little note. McCall, Saul's daughter, becomes David's wife as he is a rising star in her father's court. She loved him. And when the old king's paranoid animosity forced David to flee Gibeah, she assists in the escape. We are not told how McCall felt about her rejections. We just know that it seems like we can suppose that when her second husband, Paltiel, and her were separated, perhaps there was some sadness because she, at this point, was likely aware that King David was not someone who was going to treat her with respect and love. And we can guess that she is excluded from King David's bed afterward. And when we're looking at text, when we look at this particular story, it comes after David is ascending. So David has ascended into power as king, and it comes before the major stories of David's reign, i.e., Solomon, Bathsheba. And that is it, you guys. McCall. Interesting, interesting, isn't it? So, hope you guys enjoy learning a little bit about King David's likely first wife, who we don't know a lot about. Stop share. Have a great day.